Hi. Hi, Steph. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hopefully, everyone else.
Okay,
Thanks, Aiden.
great. All right. Thank you so much for everyone who joined online. You may or may not know, but I am Angela van der Berg. I'm the director at the Global Environmental Law Centre at the University of the Western Cape. And it really is a pleasure to host today's webinar in collaboration with Fossil Free South Africa. This is preempting the launch of this report in person in July. We're really excited about that. That will take place at UWC, and we'll send out correspondence about that. But today, if I understand correctly, is a sort of soft launch of this report. So the report is Carbon Captured, a preliminary review of the fossil fuel industry's influence and greenwashing on South Africa's campuses. I really think it is a timely and important report that asks difficult but necessary questions about the relationship between universities or higher education, fossil fuel companies, and academic integrity with climate leadership in South Africa. I won't say too much of the report, I will leave that to our speakers, but I'm very fortunate to be joined by two speakers who are actually the authors of this report. So we're joined today by David Lepage. He's the co-founder and director of Fossil Free South Africa. He has for many years been a prominent voice in climate advocacy and public environmental leadership in the country. His work has focused extensively on fossil fuel development, institutional climate responsibility, and advancing more ambitious climate action within university and civil society spaces. And then Steph, who opened up for us this morning, she is a campaigner with Fossil Free South Africa, and she's been deeply involved in climate justice advocacy, fossil fuel disinvestment campaigns, and public engagement around the role of universities and institutions in responding to the climate crisis. She's also, I think, an author of or co-author of this report, and her work focuses on the questions of accountability, public leadership, and ensuring that climate action is grounded in justice and transparency. I really look forward to our discussion today, and I'm excited for UWC to host the official launch of this report. Universities are sites of research, knowledge production, and they should also be sites of ethical leadership and public influence. So I'm excited to see how this report and the thinking around us are going to challenge us to think about whether our institutions are really aligned with the scientific realities of climate change and the values that we publicly declare to uphold. We didn't discuss this beforehand, Steph, but I assume you and David will speak and we'll hold questions to the end. And that
Yes.
everyone, all right, and everyone is welcome to ask questions in the chat, and then I'll moderate that at the end. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Angela. Yes, please do. I've actually sent the link for the report in the chat. If anybody likes to multitask and you want to scroll through it while we're speaking, and you have specific questions you'd like to ask at the end. And yeah, please do pop questions in the chat as we go, and we'll get to them at the end. And we have tried to build in time for a discussion at the end, because that's a very important part of what we hope to do here, really more than anything, is have conversation. So, you've heard a little bit about who we are, so I'll talk a bit about the organization, and then we will talk a little bit about the climate context. In our mind, it's important to understand that because it motivates why we want urgent leadership from our universities. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the power of the fossil fuel industry, and some of that information is included in the report itself, but then I will also give an overview of kind of the key highlights from the report, and then David will talk more about what that means for us in reflections and recommendations, and then some discussion. So yeah, you know who we are. And I think I want to say as well that there are actually a lot of people behind the scenes who have contributed to this report along the way. And actually something sort of worth mentioning is that we've had some people associated with universities who actually were advised by the spaces they were in at universities to not have their name publicly affiliated with this report, which is something maybe worth thinking about as we get into this. So yes, as much as I think David and I are the authors on the front of the report, I think there's so many people along the way who've contributed. And to them, those people, if you're here watching, thank you so much. So Fossil Free South Africa is a network of South Africans, and we work to secure human rights as well as prosperity for all South Africans. And we do this by challenging the financial and social support for the fossil fuel industry, which is responsible for climate change, the gravest threat to human rights and our civilization. And we want to see an end of South Africa's dependence on fossil fuels and the exploitation that it brings to our communities and our environment, with a particular focus on marginalized communities. And so our campaigns focus on the higher education space, which is our climate leadership, campus climate leadership campaign, and the financial industry through our Future We Want campaign, and greenwashing with our fossil ad ban. And I think along all of these things, we work around misinformation. And all of this is with the aim of seeing the implementation of a truly just energy transition in South Africa to a climate secure energy democracy. And with the campus climate leadership principles, at the core of it is that South African universities need to build climate leadership and challenge the social license for fossil fuels in order to support this human rights-based just transition and energy democracy. And I think Angela put it very well as well. You know, the principles that universities in South Africa themselves put forward, these do require, in our opinion, climate leadership, which also requires challenging the social license of this industry. Some major milestones from our organization. Back in 2017, for example, our organization worked with 350 Africa to get the city of Cape Town to pledge to divest from fossil fuels. And in 2014, there was an endorsement from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which was what helped get UCT to create the Responsible Investment Committee, who are supposed to be overseeing the implementation of its divestment commitment, which was another really big one in 2022. It was a 9-year campaign with over 5,000 signatures from staff and students that culminated in UCT pledging to divest, so to remove its investments from exposure to coal, oil, and gas and put it into renewable alternatives. And that 9-year campaign and that culmination is very much the genesis of what eventually became a registered nonprofit organization that today is, well, the network of South Africans, rather, that is Fossil Free South Africa today. So across some of our other campaigns as well, in recent years, we've had some really big wins. I think I'll only read out loud the one that in 2024, because it set quite a big international precedent, got a lot of international attention, was the greenwashing complaint against Total Energies. They ran a campaign with SandParks claiming to promote sustainable development, and our complaint with the Advertising Regulatory Board was upheld even after Total Energies appealed it. So that's an idea of some of what we do. But something else we've been working on is the Carbon Captured Report. And the subheading is that it is a preliminary review of fossil fuel industry influence and greenwashing on SA campuses. I think as an overview of what this report is, obviously you will learn more about this throughout the next few minutes. We found that international research is evidencing how much the fossil fuel industry is laundering their reputation and obstructing climate action in higher education spaces. And this happens largely because of a lack of transparency, so undisclosed funding, and quite a few different kinds of partnerships that allow for this organized climate obstruction. And so inspired by and building on this research, we've used publicly available information only at this stage to write a preliminary report that tries to map at least the beginnings of the extent of these kinds of relationships and partnerships at our universities in South Africa, exploring some of the questions around academic freedom to pursue a just energy transition. And the important part, I think, is that the report has recommendations for university leadership, but there are also recommendations for students as well. So again, so much of the climate leadership that we're talking about is informed by the fact that we believe that universities are the spaces where the research outlining the scale and severity of the climate change is happening. And it's really important for climate action that our universities are free to do that. And we also believe that universities must communicate the full risks of climate change to society, and that they should offer social leadership instead of giving the wrong tacit signals through maybe partnerships with some of the companies causing the climate crisis. And again, universities have endowments, pools of money that are still partly invested in companies like Sasol. And divestment is a demonstration of climate leadership, but it's also a very prudent financial strategy, and it's a condition of moral authority on the climate emergency. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David, and you will have to hear him tell me when to go to the next slide, so apologies about that.
Hi everyone, it's great to be talking to you all today, and we're very excited to be launching this report after a long time of working on it, so it's very exciting. Pardon me, just I had a moment of cramping there. So the situation we're in, and I'm quite sure I'm not speaking to any climate deniers today, but we're just going to do a brief rehash of the context that we're in. And that is that after 35 years of so-called climate actions since the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, we are still in a situation where the climate crisis is getting worse, not better, with greenhouse gas concentrations going up almost visibly. You can see here the difference between just over the last couple of years of greenhouse gas concentrations. Next slide. And unfortunately, the rate of warming is actually accelerating, not slowing down, despite all our efforts. Next slide. So, if we look at the commitments that were made at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, the objective of that conference was to try and hold average global warming to as close as possible to 1.5 degrees by 2100. But at the moment, we're on track for up to 2.8 or more degrees of warming by that time. And already global average temperatures over the past year or two have exceeded 1.5 degrees. And our warming rate here in South Africa is nearly twice the global average. Next slide. Next slide. So I've been working on climate change for nearly 20 years, and I'm still learning things about it that make me alarmed. We've recently been talking a lot about the principle of compound interest in our Conscious Capital Socially Aware Personal Finance training course. And unfortunately, with climate damage, there is a principle of compounding that comes into play as well, which is that for a long time, climate damage accumulates slowly, just as if you're lucky enough to be earning interest on your investments, your investments may seem to grow quite slowly. But then suddenly you start to hit tipping points, and there's an accelerating effect of damage. And that's the great danger that we're running into, which is by the time we realize just how much trouble we're lining up for ourselves, it's going to be very, very hard to reverse it. Next slide. And just as one example of a recent nasty effect of climate change that practically nobody has really heard of is that just last year in Alaska in 2025 in August, there was a 0.5 kilometer high tsunami that resulted from permafrost fall in an Alaskan fjord. And this is apparently something that's likely to happen even more often. Fortunately, nobody was killed in this particular instance. But if you imagine a wave that goes up to the height of the Kalk Bay Mountains here in Cape Town, that's literally what we saw as a result of this permafrost thaw happening there. Next slide. So I think for a lot of people, it's puzzling that a modern civilization was built on the back of the use of fossil fuels, and yet now we're being told that we need to stop using them, not least by the likes of us. And the question is why? What changed? And the fact is that in around about 1970, the scale of fossil fuel use just got up to a point where the negative effects, the cumulative negative effects of fossil fuels, particularly climate change, but of course so many other effects such as air pollution, just got to the point where their benefit, their costs, their externalized costs that are not properly reckoned for by economists started to outweigh their benefits. And of course, we're now well past 1970, so we're starting to see these costs manifesting as the destruction of the natural capital, if you like, that is our environment and its resilience. Next slide. So it's a little bit like if you to take a metaphor, if you were on a passenger ship that was running out of coal and you started to run that ship by throwing the decking and the furniture and whatever else you could find to throw into the boilers. You'll keep the ship moving for a while, but at great cost to the structure of the vessel that you're on. Next slide. And at this point, I'll hand back to Steph.
Thanks, David.
This industry. And just a key point of context is that the fossil fuel industry is responsible still for 85 to 90% of all emissions. There are emissions from agriculture, there are emissions from land use change, but overwhelmingly they come from the fossil fuel industry. Thanks, Steph.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think it's a very natural slide into the part that I wanted to talk about, and I think I'll just pick it up from there. So yes, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about why we focus on the fossil fuel industry based on what David has just said. So the fight against climate change is actually the fight against the fossil fuel industry. For example, in 2016, the 57 companies linked to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are so many numbers I could pull up about this. I think Saudi Aramco would be the fourth largest emitter in the world if it were a country, for example. And, I think over half of our emissions in South Africa come from Eskom and Sasol. And we see that, these companies are just not making enough progress towards their commitments towards net zero, towards transitioning into renewables companies like a lot of them say they are. And I also want to really focus in on what that looks like in South Africa. So this industry is doing a lot of harm to South Africa beyond just global warming and climate change. For example, the study came out last year from CREA and Greenpeace and finds it's a really short report that finds a lot of the different health consequences, and they try to value it in US dollars, from coal-related fine particle pollution in South Africa. So this is about air pollution caused by coal in South Africa. They estimate the economic cost of this to society at almost R1 trillion. But I think it's important to remember that this looks like dementia, strokes, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, hospitalizations, asthma, and it is always affecting the most marginalized communities that cannot afford to move away from these areas. And this is extremely expensive and very much, according to even courts in some parts of South Africa, human rights violation. I think this is another report I want to highlight that came out recently, the health toll of fossil fuels and the imperative for a just transition. I'm not going to read this extract from somebody, but it's talking about her inability to participate in other activities like other children do because of her asthma from this coal-linked air pollution. And this study in 2022 from the International Institute on Sustainable Development estimate that the continued use of fossil fuels in South Africa is 5 times higher than the government revenue from this industry. So this idea that we need this industry to keep South Africa going is just not factual and is just really good PR. For example, from the National Business Initiative also last year, they found that there's a systemic economic risk in South Africa, which is the water scarcity, energy instability, and climate disasters. And importantly, that energy instability and climate disasters are both linked to the fossil fuel industry. And this is the triple threat of increasing the costs of South Africans, stifling our economic growth, entrenching inequality, directly undermining our economic foundation and social contract. On our website, you can actually find a resource that talks a lot more about these different dimensions of harm that are holding us back from development under Climate Hope, which is a resource we have under our resources. And I do urge you to check that out, because the point I'm really trying to make is that climate change caused by fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry in South Africa are undermining every element of South Africans' well-being and economic development, rather than the other way around, as they'd have you believe. And on top of that, this is something I'd also like you to really keep in mind in reading this. The International Court of Justice last year put out an advisory opinion that makes it clear that states and institutions, like public universities, that within their jurisdiction, they have the legal obligation to phase out fossil fuel use and avoid extending fossil fuel dependence. I think these are two really important conversations we need to be having with our universities about how partnerships with these companies are meeting these legal obligations to avoid the extension of fossil fuel dependence, aka see an accelerated implementation of a truly just energy transition. Forgive me, I'm going to very quickly read through this quote from Al Gore. I know there's quite a lot of words here, but I think it's just a much better summary, put better than I could actually. So the fossil fuel industry is aggressively using captive policymakers to block meaningful solutions. As you know, they're better at capturing politicians than capturing emissions. They are the wealthiest and most powerful industry lobby in the history of the world. They make the East India Company look like a popcorn vendor. They are the effective global hegemon. They've used their war chests and legacy network of political and economic power to block any reductions of fossil fuel burning emissions, whether at the international COPs or the global negotiations for a plastic treaty. And why? They are losing the first market of electricity generation because 93% of all the new electricity generation installed worldwide last year was solar and wind. Again, I encourage you to take a look at our Climate Hope resource because we talk about how much cheaper renewables are. They're right around the corner. Al Gore frequently refers to the renewables revolution, and he says it's already happening, whether or not the fossil fuel industry wants to admit it or not. So I want to bring this home a little bit and say that we know that this is the most powerful industry lobby in the world, in the history of the world. And on the bottom right is actually a United States report on exactly this lobbying in denial, disinformation, and doublespeak that was really groundbreaking. And the following, well, just before that, there was also an influence map paper on South African advocacy from the industry on climate policy and energy transition. And then in 2025, a really important report from Just Share, the Obstruction Playbook, How Corporate Lobbying Threatens South Africa's Just Transition. And so in this report, and we do mention this in our report as well, we know that the partnerships universities have with these companies, how are we morally arguing that that's an important thing for our just energy transition when those same companies have a documented 20-year legacy of watering down and undermining every single major climate policy, climate regulation, climate law, the carbon tax, the climate change bill, and so forth. And yeah, we see this internationally, and I suppose our report is basically saying that we need to ask these questions at home. If we know the fossil fuel industry is donating to somebody like Trump, which they are, and we see that he's rolling back so many important policies, and a lot of the research on this comes from the United States, we have to ask about how these patterns are operating in South Africa. And I want to draw attention to some of also what informs our approach at our organization as a whole, actually. So climate denial has typically in the past, on the left, we have the old denial, right? Record coal destroys global warming narrative. Maybe ice age coming, the joke of how can it be global warming if it's so cold right now? And we see that there's a documented shift in misinformation to instead undermining renewable alternatives and solutions. So they no longer deny that climate change exists. And this is from a 2026 paper, Mapping Emerging Climate Misinformation Playbooks in the Global South. And the reason Just Share used the term playbooks, by the way, is because it comes from the fact that we have seen the exact same pattern with the tobacco industry's lobbying. And I'm not going to talk about this in depth, and I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the PR industry builds outwards, starting here with intellectual license and starting here where higher education is concerned, peer-reviewed scholarship, thought leadership, scientific experts and witnesses, access to academia, recruiting. And this is an important part of eventually getting social license. And so you can see how our concern here is that the recommendations we put forward are about challenging this propaganda spectrum that is holding us back from a just transition. So to bring a bit of context into South Africa, we have something called carbon lock-in. And some of the reason why South Africa is in a unique position with South Africa, I've tried to summarize here, but I hope you read the report. Our government often frames climate change as though it doesn't have someone who's responsible for it. And this silence mirrors the global pattern of that silence, the passive voice. Even talking about the storms in Cape Town, not talking about climate change, talking about climate change, not talking about the just energy transition and coal. And this is called by academics and researchers the minerals energy complex, which is basically an institutional lock-in where for a very long time, back from colonial early colonial times in South Africa, we have low-cost mining, which allows us to later on have low-cost electricity, which means low cost, and we have low-cost coal, and all of this bundles up together so that the state protects the system, because the system allows our whole economy to work well off of this like cheap system. And what that means is that our state has historically reinforced the system rather than challenged it, which is why people talk about the difficulty of moving policy in South Africa around this issue. And Sasol in particular was founded by the apartheid government because South Africa needed fuel self-sufficiency because of international sanctions. And it remains an extremely powerful lobbying force and like financial power in South Africa. For example, in the Just Share report, you'll see about how it had an influence on the carbon tax policy being far weaker than it should be. And it's really entrenched and seen as a pillar of our economy. And this lock-in is very difficult to change. And it's very expensive in the sense that it's expensive for the amount of change we're able to put into place towards a just energy transition. And it holds us back from making those changes, even if they are scientifically and financially more sound than the current system we are working on. And this matters for higher education because fossil fuel companies, especially Sasol, have for a long time dominated the research funding, not just in South African universities, but also in South African universities. They're a huge contributor to corporate research and development in general. And it makes sense that given all of this context, this same lock-in affects our higher education. The fact that we see these companies so entrenched in our universities is because they're very entrenched in our country. And I'm going to give a brief overview of the first international review that kicked all of this off for us. I know this wasn't in the notes that I was going to mention, but the story of how this report came to be was that David suggested I write a short blog post for our newsletter about fossil fuel industry partnerships at universities. And I came back to him and told him I'd found this journal article, and the rest is history. All the rest is on our website in a very long document with, I think, 8 pages of references now. So this was a study that was done from academics across a few universities, and it looks at fossil fuel industry influence in universities across the UK, Canada, and the USA. And Australia. And it basically finds that the industry partners strategically with universities to lend an aura of credibility to deception campaigns. And these are the exact words of this peer-reviewed study. I've never read a peer-reviewed study that actually upset me so much I had to stop reading for a bit, actually. They found that it silences opposition voices, and these companies establish these partnerships with institutions to enhance credibility, shape research programs, and to provide studies supportive of a prolonged life for oil and gas, leverage the resulting research to their advantage, bolster access to policymakers. So importantly, this has real-world impacts that slow down the transition to renewables. New documents reveal previously unknown levels of funding and how companies condition their funding on academics' cooperation and alignment with companies' business needs. I will skip the commentary that I have on that for the minute and just say, again, the abstract from this journal really shows that universities are an established, under-researched vehicle of climate obstruction by this industry. And largely this is because of a lack of transparency around partnerships, while the industry poses a challenge to research. So really what we are going to be talking about when David gets into this is really a call for transparency and really proactive and explicit investigations from our universities into this. Because without it, how do we know that this isn't happening? The study that we're referring to has this neat little graph that actually just shows that examination of this industry's ties to higher education has been growing. I would say that in my professional experience, this line going directly up, I know that that's also just how the graph works, but there's been, I would say, kind of an explosion in this kind of evidence coming out all over the world about this kind of lobbying. And to give you, again, this is from the study, but we've summarized it into a nice little graphic, so you don't have to read the journal article, of what these ties actually look like. So these are what these fossil fuel companies get out of partnerships with universities. And it includes things like fossil fuel-friendly policies, fossil fuel-friendly support for continued production, the public perception, seeing these companies as trying to solve climate change, aka greenwashing, legal proceedings in their favor by funding things like law schools, they get to save money by having employees on campus. Petro-education is a term in academia for kind of promoting climate denialism sometimes, not always. And I think also here is a really big one to pay attention to for us is the promotion of research on technological fixes instead of a transition to renewables. And I think that transition to renewables in our context, very much in the global south, can be seen as focusing on the technological fixes, like inventing something new, rather than important radical transformation to a different way of doing our system that gets us closer to a kind of energy democracy. And this is a quote that's directly from this study that we're referencing. A 1978 manual for industries facing regulation in the fossil fuel industry, for instance, advised, quote, co-opting academics and, quote, identifying the leading experts in each relevant field, hiring them as consultants or advisors, giving them research grants, and the like. It must not be too blatant, for the experts themselves must not recognize that they have lost their objectivity. And again, just to give some kind of examples, this is also from the study we're referring to that I made into nice little graphs so that you don't have to read it all in walls of text in the journal article. That, for example, we see here government-funded energy research. This was at 2 universities. We see that 15% went to renewables, 52% went to the continued business of fossil fuel industry operations. The same thing here with 2 other universities in the United States, where energy and environment research fund wins. 11% renewables, 60% fossil fuel. Here, I know it's missing from here, but it was actually Rice University and Oxford University at their energy research centers. Only 5% was about promoting renewable energy. And this study also found a huge lack of disclosure from a lot of universities around these partnerships and this funding, even on request. And what I want to call attention to, and I do realize this is a little bit outdated because it's from 2022, but it's important to understand that this goes on top of, this industry is one of the biggest sponsors of corporate R&D around the world, and yet only 1% of their revenue in 2022 and 2021 went to clean energy capital expenditure. So the idea that they're leading the way in the transition to renewables is just not supported by the evidence. It's only supported by their advertising. And the researchers of this paper had the following recommendations that you'll see influence our work very deeply, which is basically transparency and public disclosure, transparency and improved management of conflict of interests, public registries disclosing universities' relationship with these companies, enhanced ethical guidelines for accepting donations. We put together just some kind of pictures to give you an idea of kind of how frequently you may see fossil fuel companies at our universities. And I suppose the exciting part that a lot of people want to know about from the report, I only pulled some of the examples, but we've got every single public-facing example that David and I could find of a fossil fuel industry partnership with a South African university is in the table inside this report. And I want to say that if anybody reading it thinks, surely this isn't all of it, that's correct. It was only what we could find publicly. There was even a Sasol partnership with the University of Cape Town to do with a hydrogen project that we saw in the news. And then those news articles at some point over the last few years were taken down. Maybe that partnership ended, maybe it didn't. But the point is, we don't actually know. And I think something important to think about is, if this is what's publicly available, what else don't we know? And how can we find that information out? Because we do need to know. So I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see things like UCT's Shell endowed the chair of environmental humanities until 1973. Sasol spent almost R1 billion on a green kerosene project they have with UCT Center of Excellence in Catalysis. We see Sasol chairs, we see Exxaro funding the chair in Global Change Institute at WITS, and also a note that the Global Change Institute actually did end they came to an end of their partnership with Exxaro, so it's no longer called the Exxaro Global Change Institute chair because of the mixed message that it sends for one of the country's leading effectively climate science institutions to be partnered with Exxaro. We also see things like hosting climate deniers and coal lobbyists, the Sasol Library, Shell's ex-chairman is the Chancellor of University of the Free State, and the chair in climate and sustainability transitions from Exxaro. And an important one that we wanted to highlight as well is a 150 million rand collaboration between the National Research Foundation and Sasol. And as you can see, this is all sort of framed as being for the just energy transition, sort of, although they don't use that language. So for green energy, right? energy and power systems, green hydrogen energy storage, circular economy. And Sasol was sponsoring research at most universities in the country as of 2015. And interestingly enough, it seems to feel, this isn't in the report, and this is really an aside, I sometimes feel as though information became more and more scarce, even though I don't think that the partnerships or the funding became more and more scarce, because I think a lot of companies and institutions are concerned about litigation and greenwashing. But I don't think that should hold these institutions back from being transparent nonetheless. And yeah, I think that, you know, the real point that I want to make here is not at all that this is a conspiracy that, you know, is an accusation towards our universities or our academics at all. It is, however, a call to really address and ask questions and maybe even do more research into within universities or from academics or from civil society into these kinds of partnerships in order to build ethical guardrails that protect us from the kind of organized climate obstruction that we have seen all over the world. Harvard, Oxford, all of these leading universities have this problem. And we've also seen a huge rise in divestment. And I think I'm maybe getting into the territory of David's recommendations section. So I think I'm going to leave it there. But just to say that if it's happening everywhere else, we do need to ask how South Africa's higher education can avoid a similar fate. Whether or not we know it's happening or not, we at least need to be able to say it isn't happening. But we can't take it at the word of these companies based on their history. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I do see there's another slide here. David, do you mind if I add a couple extra points to say? I forgot about these. To say that these companies like Sasol, you know, we have these greenwashing relationships where they sort of paint themselves as these kind of green energy centers of excellence where they're driving this decarbonization. And it is a PR communication effort. And it is something that is concerning when we look at the real world actions of companies like Sasol, where they're, investors urged to reject Sasol's climate plans as credibility concerns mount, new route to emissions goal after refocusing on coal. And to really say that, is it really the right message to be sending in terms of social license for our universities to have such close partnerships with these universities? And we understand that, we need money to come from somewhere, and Global South universities have a difficult time with funding, and we completely understand that. But it's just important to think about the ethics of what it means for our country when we continue to further enable the entrenchment of this coal regime that we effectively are trying to get out of. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steph. So before we get into questions, I'm just going to offer a few quick further thoughts. And just bringing us back to the South African context, because we're often told that we need to kind of slow down the transition away from coal in South Africa to look after jobs. But the problem is at the moment that every job that currently exists in the fossil fuel industry worldwide is already contributing to job losses around the world at a very scary rate. So at the moment, IEA figures and International Labour Organization figures show that every current job that we have in the fossil fuel industry around the world adds up to a job, 2 to 3 other jobs that will be lost due to the effects of climate change just by 2030. Next slide. So really our hope in putting together this report is that we want to see South African universities to become really vocal on this issue of climate change. It's a fundamental human rights struggle. It is not a time where we can sort of afford to equivocate about who is causing this crisis anymore. We need to be clear about it, and we need to take the proper actions. We think that it would be counterproductive to suggest that fossil fuel companies and academics with associations with them should be outright blacklisted or anything, although that form of disassociation is being pursued by some universities abroad. But for now, we think that the really, really important first step is transparency, transparency, transparency. and for academics and universities to think twice and three times before taking on these partnerships, which we know are the results, not very often, not of sort of bad intentions, but of a long history of our country being sort of particularly fossil fuel intensive. Next slide. Sorry, could we mute Motomoni perhaps? So thanks. So our Campus Climate Leadership Pledge really starts with calling on universities to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, to be transparent about fossil fuel industry ties, and for us to have far more vocal and visionary leadership from our universities and their representatives. And we really encourage you to sign on to our Campus Climate Leadership Pledge, ideally as faculties or departments, but as individuals as well. And I'll stop there and hand it to Angela to take on some questions.
Thank you so much for that very revealing report and overview of it. I appreciate it. Also, the work that went into it. It's so important to start and keep this conversation going. I'm going to hand over to the online audience. I have been monitoring the chat and I haven't seen questions in the chat, but that doesn't mean that we don't have questions. So those who are online and have a question, you are free to raise your hand.
Also comments, I suppose.
Yeah, questions or comments. Otherwise, I'll kick off with a question, but I would love to give the audience an opportunity first.
I don't even know how we do that.
Thanks, Angela, and we'd be very happy to share the slides. By the way, I'm seeing that question in the chat, so absolutely, we'll share the slides.
Okay, there are two questions. Shall I take these two and then you can address them? All right. The first question, let's take Laurie Lake.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I work at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town. My work is really focused on conflicts of interest linked to the commercial milk formula industry. So companies that produce formula milk and the ways in which that's displacing breastfeeding. And their strategy is to, amongst other things, is to fund academic research, prizes, conferences, research, in order to generate really conflicts of interest and to promote their interest, but given the really powerful role that academics play in shaping policy, clinical guidelines, and healthcare practice. And we've talked a lot about the importance of disclosure as a first step, making these conflicts more visible. But declaring a conflict of interest doesn't eliminate that conflict. It simply notes that it's there. And so certainly, for example, in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, we have adopted a very clear position statement saying that we will no longer take any funding from the formula milk industry. So a much clearer stance that is more along the lines of divesting from industry. So I just wanted to put that on the table because I don't think declarations of conflict of interest go anywhere near far enough to uproot this pervasive problem that is not simply one that is limited to the fossil fuel industry. I also wanted to alert you to the work that Leslie London and others have done in developing very clear guidelines for research ethics committees so that they are better equipped to identify and address conflicts of interest within the academy. yeah, so just wanting to put that into or share that as part of the toolkit, and to say we need to be talking across different, I don't know, different domains, different sectors, because these are common challenges common to the food industry, tobacco, as you've already noted, climate, social media, etc., etc. And there's just not enough awareness within the academy of the damage that these sources of funding cause to academic integrity and independence. Thanks.
Do you want to comment on that, or should we move to the next question or comment?
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, I'll comment quickly. And Laurie, I think your points are really, really well taken. And I tend to agree that merely declaring the conflicts of interest and transparency ultimately are not sufficient. But I think from our point of view, we sit sort of half in and half out of this space. And what we'd really love to see is the discussions around stronger measures against these kinds of partnerships being led from within academics, within South African academia itself, rather than us coming in from the outside and saying this is what you should be doing necessarily. I think it'd be more persuasive if that sort of initiative comes from inside. But I really do take your point, and thank you for pointing to Leslie London's precedents, and that's really worth looking at as well.
Thank you. Shall we give to Aidan?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I wanted to firstly say well done, Steph and David, and everyone else involved. It really, really is an awesome body of work, and I'm so excited to see the journey this whole report goes on. My question's kind of twofold. Is firstly, in your research, what kind of tactics did you find were most useful in exposing funding and all of those kinds of relationships, like revealing them? And then secondly, how do we avoid a university backsliding to where they declare some progressive policies on investment or partnerships, but then behind closed doors they go back on those, as we have seen in places maybe like UCT is a good example, where they do have a good stance and then they slowly start going back on that. Thank you very much.
Do you want to take this one, Steph?
Yes, thank you. It's just such a good question, Aidan. Thank you very much as well. I think that I'm hoping David will also tack onto this, but to just say that one of the parts of this answer in the report, we do have a section on how we can learn from other international universities and how they've responded. I think that this is the best I can do at this stage for answering, based on what I read about what other universities did. So, for example, at Yale, they actually appointed an expert faculty panel to create an ethical investment principle set that governs fossil fuel ties. And this set of investment principles now informs the Yale Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility, which is very similar in name, at least, to, for example, UCT's Responsible Investment Committee. And part of that involved making fossil fuel divestment recommendations to the trustees. And it was based on an evaluation framework that they created, requiring fossil fuel companies to prioritize sustainable practices and advance a decarbonized energy future shift in order for them to have a partnership with that fossil fuel with that fossil fuel company. And so similarly, I think at universities like Cambridge and Oxford, Stanford, Columbia, they all did something along the lines of doing some kind of internal stock taking, if you want to use a loose term like that. Stanford created a policy lab, which investigated literally how to determine whether a company has obstructed climate policies, was the question. And they came up with, kind of a whole set of recommendations for Stanford, which are now kind of, as of 2024 at least, there was an oversight and review system that was being built as a result of that. So I think part of it is that I really do think that I would love to see universities in South Africa actually put together some kind of expert panel of some kind, review committee, policy lab, whatever it is, to ask those kinds of questions of the institution itself, and then to put those recommendations forward to something like a responsible investment committee if the university has one, which we would also like to see the universities in South Africa that don't have one of those, to create some kind of body that takes that feedback in. I think the other thing that we haven't seen from the universities themselves anyway, but comes from, I think, outside of maybe the universities themselves, are these kinds of public registries or some kind of collection of publicly available documenting of these partnerships. The Campus Climate Network, for example, mostly based in North America, but we have been in touch with them, and they also are part of what inspired this work. They help students at campuses across the world to do research and create student-made reports, and you can view all of them for free on their website. And maybe I'll find the link just now and put it in the chat. But for example, that is kind of like a publicly available forum where they track what kind of funding and where and how much. I think in South Africa, we are in a bit of a unique situation with that, because I think that, again, that would be really effective, but we need the universities to come on board with us in order to do that. I think we need leaders in higher education to kind of carry that torch with us. I think I'm going to leave my answer there for now, and I see there are other hands. David, if you have any comments to add to Aidan's question, you can jump in. Otherwise, maybe Angela can pick the next hand. I see there are also some questions in the chat.
Just quickly, Aidan, just to add that the only way to stop backsliding from universities on their commitments is constant vigilance, which is the approach that we've taken at UCT, which is to follow up again and again and again on their divestment commitment, for example.
Thank you. Laurie, I assume you've asked your question already, unless that's a new hand. I'm going to take the next question from Susan then, and there is a question in the chat. It's just about how transparent are universities' investment portfolios?
Should I come in first? Yeah,
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Like Laurie, I'm working in health and looking at commercial determinants of health, of which, of course, fossil fuels is one. And one of the things that I have recognized over the years is it's easy to tell universities and various organizations to disinvest or divest from whatever it is that they're getting money from. It's more difficult to find that money. And in health, in many countries, what they've done is they've developed a thing called the Health Promotion Foundation, which is basically a money laundering tool, because in the end, we want these polluters to be paying for the harm that they're causing. So I guess that might be the climate fund. I'm not sure how it works in this particular field, but we really need to try and sort of substitute the real need that organizations and universities have with clean money, if you like. And we maybe can do that laundering ourselves.
Yes, thanks very much, Susan. I mean, I think we see that a lot of the interest from people in sort of really taking substantial efforts on this sector, this issue, comes from people in public health, and we really appreciate the interest and the analogies that you're drawing, and those are things that we should definitely be looking at. And those are very powerful precedents to draw on as well in making the arguments for the kinds of disassociation that we think should follow more naturally from the reported information that we've developed here.
And sorry, I super quickly wanted to jump in. I feel like there may be another question in the chat I don't know about, but I also want to say that inside the report, there is actually a link that should be clickable, or a QR code, where there's actually a Google form where people can anonymously share examples of partnerships or I suppose, even disclose information and that they would like to. So if, I kind of bring that back to some other things just about, the transparency things and some of the conversations happening in the chat as well. So I just wanted to make that clear to everyone as well, that is in there, because I realized we didn't mention that.
Thank you. I think our webinar is only for an hour, but if I could squeeze my questions in briefly, and maybe we can take this further at the in-person launch. I was wondering how we, or you, or any of us, distinguishes between legitimate industry collaboration and problematic institutional capture, as you refer. And then what role do you think students and early career researchers can play in pushing universities towards greater accountability with their funding? I'm thinking also about mid-level academics that are already linked to fossil fuel funded projects. What can be done in those instances?
Thanks, Angela. Those are great questions. I think the first, on the second question, what people can do, I mean, I really think that if mid-level researchers can push their departments to start endorsing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty or our Climate Leadership Platform, that would be really, really powerful. Sorry, I've forgotten your first question.
It was really just about distinguishing between sort of
distinguishing, the ones that the partnerships that are in good faith and good not. Well, to take, for example, the SASL research partnerships that we see happening at universities. Those partnerships, when you look at them, the research that they're doing looks like it's worthwhile research, but the research never gets scaled up. It never becomes commercially deployed. There's a lot of public relations around it, and the public relations never mentions the climate context of the company involved. And the companies involved themselves, like SASL particularly, are not showing that they're making an effort to transition in their other operations. So I think you have to look at it contextually, and then you can make a distinction between a good faith research partnership and a partnership that is really just there to kind of cover up for the fossil fuel industry. I hope that helps.
Sorry, and just to add as a small note as well, I think also a lot of what we've talked about, I think exactly that question of how we determine what is legitimate funding, that is exactly the kind of thing that we want to see universities ask and figure out and recommend, and so I think when we make these references to proactive investigations and proactive examination and explicit proactive ethical guardrails, that is exactly what we are talking about, is for universities and departments to undertake that kind of work with a specific magnifying glass on the fossil fuel industry in context of this information. My secret hope is that after all this work, it will inspire university leadership to maybe read the whole report and maybe do exactly that, of answering what the criteria are for that, as universities overseas have done, like I was mentioning when I was speaking to Aidan. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that we've gone over time quite a bit now, but it's good to see engagement with this topic and with your report. And I really look forward to hosting you in person in July. And as said in the beginning of the webinar, we will release the information for that launch event pretty soon. But thanks everyone for joining, and thank you to Steph and David for not just presenting the report, but for this important work that you do. And we'll be speaking again soon.
Thanks very much.